One of the things that sticks out for me is that there's three major, I think, Supreme Court nomination hearings that really stick out in history for me. Now, and we should say this, on the Democrats have had multiple people who had to step aside. Lana Guinier, Greenberg, I think it was during the Clinton years because he had smoked pot, had to step aside. But Republicans tend to ride it out, except for, I guess, of Robert Bork. Robert Bork was one of them. Clarence Thomas was the other, and Brett Kavanaugh. So let's give us a sense of the context in which Brett Kavanaugh was nominated. He was obviously Donald Trump's nominee, which I imagine was a strike against him for a lot of people. But there was a lot more invested in that moment, too.
Yeah, it was an important moment. He was nominated to replace Justice Kennedy, who had been for years the swing justice on all kinds of important cases and decisions, right? So you could already see the prospect of the balance of power on the court shifting to the right with Kavanaugh's addition to the court. So you already had kind of the partisan forces aligned for war over Kavanaugh's confirmation. You also had Kavanaugh's background being a factor. Even before the allegations against him, this was somebody who had not followed the kind of traditional path for a lot of Supreme Court justices, where you either spend time in academia or a lot of your life on serving as a judge on lower courts. He had served on the D.C. Circuit Court, but before that had effectively been kind of a partisan operative. He had worked as on the Ken Starr investigation against Bill Clinton. He then worked on the Florida recount for the Bush campaign, worked inside the Bush White House where George W. Bush took a liking to him and eventually added him to the D.C. Circuit. But he had a more partisan path to the Supreme Court. And so that was another strike against him for a lot of liberals. And then, of course, you had Donald Trump kind of in his natural inclination to create more noise and fan the flames of controversy and partisanship. So all of that was kind of the context for this nomination. And then once you had Christine Blasey Ford come forward with her allegation that he had sexually assaulted her when they were both in high school, everything kind of blew up. Right. And I don't know about you, I remember those kind of 2 or 3 weeks as some of the most intense weeks of the Trump era. Just the national debate was ferocious. The amount of animus in that kind of battle. And then, of course, I think the climax in a lot of ways was Brett Kavanaugh's famous testimony in that hearing where he kind of lost it, right? He got angry. He talked about the consequences of his nomination and how Democrats would reap the whirlwind. He led a lot of people to believe that he was going to seek partisan revenge on his political enemies once he got to the bench. And then he was confirmed. And so that was kind of the starting point for me for this story. You know, 3 years after his nomination, what kind of justice is he becoming? What kind of justice will he be? And will his kind of contentious path to the Supreme Court change his trajectory at all? Will it influence the kind of justice he is? Because as you point out, and this was my biggest takeaway too, these 9 justices are not just kind of enlightened black-robed figures dispensing wisdom from on high. They are human beings who are governed by, yes, their judicial worldviews, but also politics and ego and grievance and status anxieties and internal politics. And all of that stuff matters. The Supreme Court internal dynamics are much messier than they let on.
And in fact, he was also a clerk for Kennedy.
Yes.
And so talk about that, because you don't mention that in the piece, but there's been rumors that like Kennedy sort of pushed Kavanaugh on some level.
Well, even more than rumors, there's been reporting that Kennedy told the White House that he was considering stepping down, retiring, but that he wanted to have some say in who would replace him, that he wouldn't get to choose, but he wanted them to seriously consider Kavanaugh, who was not on Trump's initial shortlist, was not really a conservative favorite for the reasons that we've mentioned. He was not seen as kind of a fire-breathing culture warrior, and therefore was not somebody that the Federalist Society crowd would naturally kind of pick, although he was part of the team. But yes, it's been reported that Kennedy kind of advanced his name and said, I want you to take him seriously. And I do mention in the piece that there was an intense lobbying campaign to get him nominated. There were from all of Kavanaugh's allies in Republican politics, and he has a lot of influential allies. To your point, this is a guy who's been very successful at cultivating the right mentors throughout his life. Kennedy was the most prominent, but all the way from back in college, throughout his days on the Ken Starr investigation, in the Bush White House, he was good at cozying up to the people in power, the bosses, and that kind of pushed him forward in his career. So when it came time for Trump to nominate his second Supreme Court justice after Gorsuch, that lobbying campaign is probably the thing that pushed Kavanaugh across the finish line over some other justices that might have been a more natural fit for Trump. I even report in the piece, Kavanaugh was not really a Trump guy. He didn't like Trump that much. And, I quote one friend who say he was not a fan of Donald Trump, but he was not going to say no to a nomination. He had to kiss the ring to get there. And that is very much kind of the way that Kavanaugh has navigated a lot of his career.
And Kavanaugh, if I remember correctly, I mean, many people I'm sure remember when Donald Trump held up that list from the Heritage Foundation when he was running and said, like, here's my list of Supreme Court justices, because Donald Trump did not have a list of Supreme Court justices. That was not one of the things that he was probably prepping for. But the fact that he would hold up the list from the Heritage Foundation basically signaled to many, particularly the cultural conservatives and the religious conservatives, that, like, I'm here to do your bit. I have no stake in this other than what will help me. And my understanding is Kavanaugh was not on that original list. And so he was a late breaking thing. And I wonder if in the course of your reporting, what was that sense that the intense lobbying on behalf of Kavanaugh was also sort of like, look, you can justify this even though he's not on your list, right? There was 12 other people, 25 people ahead of him. But that this is the one that's going to open up the slot. Because Kavanaugh, how much was that a part of it?
I was never able to establish like a clear quid pro quo, and I know other reporters have looked into it as well. I think, if anything, what seems to be the case is that the White House understood, and Don McGahn in particular, who was kind of running point on the Kavanaugh confirmation, understood that with a wink and a nod and sending the right signals, that would help usher Kennedy into retirement. But I don't think it was, I don't know, but I was never able to establish that there was a clear transaction that took place.
It's interesting because, again, that edifies the point of your entire piece, which is these are human beings and they have agendas that aren't necessarily a function of 400 years of common law when they're making these decisions. I mean, lastly, before we take a break here, one of the things that struck me about this hearing, you didn't write about that. And when we take a break, we're going to come back and we're going to talk about your reporting about Kavanaugh since he got on the court, which is really the point here. But one other thing that struck me about his hearing that has always stayed with me, when he had told, there was something that he and a bunch of his buddies had written about a woman that in their yearbook, that was some type of very juvenile and demeaning to this woman, like code. I think they called her some type of fan or of the football team or something like that. That implied, that implied something about this woman. The details aren't as important as everyone in that hearing room knew exactly what that was. Everybody. He said that was just my way of an homage to her. Right. Everybody knew he was lying. And that moment, to me, was huge because it, A, showed what he was willing to do. And B, it also showed that the Donald Trump strategy of doubling down on a lie like that can work for anybody, regardless of what their station is. I found that moment to be really, really poignant. Hi, I'm Sam Seder. You can watch the rest of this interview and more on our Peacock show, which streams at 5 p.m. weekdays on The Choice from Peacock TV.